This video shows how Palantir Gotham can be used to deliver a comprehensive understanding of major events as they unfold in real time. Here, by integrating open source data from news media and NGOs, we have been able to track and assess the factors behind the escalation and subsequent de-escalation of Sudanese unrest during the summer of 2012. After South Sudan seceded from Sudan in July 2011, the North lost 75% of its oil resources. This led to a severe economic crisis that was exacerbated when disputes between the two countries led to a halt in southern oil production in late January 2012. In order to combat rampant inflation and surging food prices, Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir's ruling National Congress Party imposed severe austerity measures. Al-Bashir and his party have been in power since leading a coup in 1989, after which they dissolved trade unions and seized control of the press. Bashir himself is wanted by the ICC for genocide in Darfur, and his government is currently battling armed rebel groups in Darfur and around the country. In Khartoum, the NCP faces opposition parties looking to gain power, and a new generation of educated and progressive youth, such as the popular resistance movement Garifna, founded in 2009 and meaning "we are fed up." Protests began on June 16th in the Sudanese capital of Khartoum, after the NCP approved austerity measures lifting fuel and food subsidies. Opposition parties, including the coalition National Consensus Forces, immediately called for demonstrations. By the following day, protests had already begun at universities across Sudan. In the first week, demonstrations were mostly led by students. And we can see, by searching for unrest that occurred at Sudanese universities, that the University of Khartoum became a major hub for protests. Many of the protests have violent crackdown events associated with them, as police, the National Security Services, and pro-regime supporters use tear gas and batons to disperse protesters. We can easily drill down to find individuals who we know have been arrested during the protests. Many protesters and journalists were detained at demonstrations, and the security services raided the homes and headquarters of opposition leaders and activists. For each detainee, we can see a profile of the individual, the events and organizations related to the arrest, and the sources for this information. In these documents, we can see that security forces also allegedly tried to prevent activists injured in the demonstrations from receiving medical care. Despite the crackdowns, protests gained steam throughout the week and peaked on Friday, when the Garifna movement, inspired by the Arab Spring, called for a day of rage. The first week of protests spread far from Khartoum, from El Obeid all the way to Port Sudan in the east. We can see the hotspots where protests are concentrated, such as the University of Khartoum and the Imam Abdulrahman Mosque in the Khartoum suburb of Omdurman. We can see that this mosque is associated with the opposition National Ummah Party's Ansar sect of Islam. For several weeks, opposition parties co-opted the movement, taking advantage of Friday prayers as an opportunity to mobilize protesters. At the same time, Garifna activists continued to call for days of rage on Fridays, which is where we see protest activity concentrated. The second such Friday was termed the Friday of Elbow Licking by activists, in response to the NCP's vice chairman's claims that trying to overthrow the regime was like trying to lick your own elbow. And the progressive bent of the activists is reflected in the fourth Friday, which was termed Kendaka Friday after a legendary ancient queen, and dedicated to the struggle of Sudanese women. As the protests gained steam, opposition groups took the opportunity to join together, anticipating a post-Bashir government. On July 4th, opposition parties, led by the NCF, signed a joint declaration calling for power sharing and more freedoms under a post-Bashir democratic constitutional alternative. Then, as protesters were gearing up for Kendaka Friday, the regime responded to the protests and the opposition's democratic alternative by offering several concessions. On July 7th, Bashir said he would involve other parties in drafting a, quote, 100% Islamic constitution. 2 days later, His first vice president said that the government would approach opposition parties for dialogue on sharing power and work on a new constitution. On that same day, Bashir reversed a resolution by the Minister of Finance to lift wheat subsidies and increase the price of wheat. While these concessions are limited, they show at least token willingness to acknowledge the demands of both the opposition parties and the people. Shortly after these events, the main opposition mosques stopped holding protests after prayers. By this point, opposition leaders may have wanted to curb their involvement in order to hedge their bets if the protests failed, as well as pursue further political concessions from al-Bashir's government. We can see that the following day of rage called for by activists was a significant de-escalation from previous Fridays, and there are few protests by mid-July. Why did the protest movement die down instead of continuing to escalate in the face of a crackdown, as it had in Libya, Syria, and elsewhere? Likely factors include the lack of unions, press freedom, or widespread access to technology. Another potentially interesting factor is that the regime in Sudan appeared to deliberately avoid the use of lethal force. In the first 5 weeks in Sudan, only one protester was reported to have died as a result of the government's crackdown. The government likely wanted to avoid the experience of countries such as Egypt, where social media turned civilian victims like 28-year-old Khaled Said into martyrs for a revolution. Furthermore, the government, which is battling armed militant groups, may have feared driving protesters into an alliance with the rebels. Main rebel groups, including the Sudanese People's Liberation Movement North and the coalition Sudanese Revolutionary Front, have voiced support for peaceful protests. While there were no confirmed reports of protesters allying with the rebels, there have been state reports from the National Security Services that rebels have tried to traffic arms to the protesters. It's possible that the lack of civilian fatalities kept unrest from turning into a revolution, even despite the regime's use of excessive force. However, on July 31st, 6 weeks after protests began, security forces fired live bullets on protesters in Nyala, Darfur. 12 were reported killed and over 50 injured. Most of the victims were high school students. This killing led to a spike in events around Nyala, but did not spread beyond the immediate area. For these Darfuri students, who come from marginalized areas that have seen heavy fighting and displacement since 2003, the government forces were not as restrained as they were in Khartoum. By this point, the protests in Khartoum had effectively died out after Ramadan took hold on July 19th. While fasting all day, there was little chance that protesters would be able to regain their momentum. As al-Bashir boasted, the protesters found only a burning hot summer instead of an Arab Spring. Meanwhile, the Sudanese economic outlook has improved following the recent agreement between the governments of Sudan and South Sudan to reopen oil production. Without further economic deterioration, mass unrest may very well continue to lay dormant.